2020 has fundamentally changed the context in which South African municipalities govern and provide services. Future Cities Africa has partnered with South African Cities Network on a series of 4 episodes that look at how cities have fared during the pandemic and what fundamental lessons have been learned. We cover economic recovery, climate change, governance and municipal finance, and built environment. Kayla Brown is project manager for the built environment at South African Cities Network. Kayla, welcome. Give us a brief introduction on your role at South African Cities Network.
Thanks, Dan. So I am the Built Environment Project Manager at the South African Cities Network. And what that primarily entails is the convening of a task team of built environment officials from across the different metros in South Africa. And we call it the BET, which stands for the Built Environment Integration Task Team. And what we use this group of practitioners to do is to drive a practitioner-centric research agenda to understand from their perspective what is hindering spatial transformation in South African cities. And over the last few years in the program, there's kind of been a shift from the technical aspects of the built environment to focusing more on what the institutional factors are that are prohibiting spatial transformation from taking place. So we're really focusing on the rules of the institution that drive a certain practitioner's behavior.
Before we dive into built environment, let's reflect on the State of Cities report of 2016. Since that, what has changed for the better and what has changed for the worse?
In terms of the built environment, and specifically spatial transformation, the overwhelming evidence suggests that, unfortunately, things have largely stayed the same at best. We are no closer really to achieving any kind of actual spatial transformation at scale. But what has happened since the previous State of Cities report in 2016 is that there are many exciting advances in very progressive policies, plans, framework legislation. So for example, the Integrated Urban Development Framework of 2016, SPLUMA, which is the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, which commenced in 2015, the formulation of the Built Environment Performance Plans, or the BEPS. And these are all instruments that are meant to direct planning in a targeted and strategic fashion when they work together to reconfigure the spatial inequalities of the past. So for the last State of Cities report, these instruments were only just coming into formation. And now 5 years later, we're seeing them being adopted and practitioners are able to make sense of them and understand how they all work together. So these plans are very necessary, but they are incredibly complex as well. And to understand how they all relate to each other takes a lot of time, and there are many different interpretations of them. So while the legal adoption of all of these instruments is a massive step forward, they're definitely not sufficient on their own. And the key factor is implementation. So the policies mean absolutely nothing without implementation. And for that to take place, it's about a capable state. So when we talk about issues of the built environment and spatial transformation, we have to talk about issues of governance as well and state capability. Because while the policy foundations are there, we need to understand how best to use these instruments to achieve the desired change.
Working closely with practitioners through the Built Environment Integration Task Team, can you share what this time has meant for city practitioners?
I think this has been such a difficult time for practitioners. There's been so many burdens during the pandemic. These are people working in a highly complex and highly pressured environment with quite an unforgiving institutional culture. So as the task team, or the BET, we have really been focusing a lot on the emotional well-being of practitioners. And when the lockdown started in the beginning of the pandemic, we actually hosted weekly virtual check-ins for city officials across the different metros. And it gave people a chance to just pause and reflect about what was going on around them. And we found there was a big appetite for engaging in this way. So then from July last year, we started a program called Healing Fields, which is premised on the idea that as South Africans, we have never really taken the time to heal our wounds. So for practitioners working in government and in the city, how are we meant to build a happy and healthy future if ourselves we are not taking the time to heal? So this time has been exciting, I think, as well as being incredibly daunting and pressured to carve out that time for reflection and learning, which is not something that we're very good at. So it's been energizing to see how much people need this and need to connect at a much deeper level and at a very human level with each other. But apart from that, I think it's also been exciting to see how quickly action can take place in a time of crisis. And I think there have been so many wins for government during this time, and really good thinking and progressive solutions to some of the key issues that we have been facing.
What has the pandemic brought to the fore with regards to the built environment?
I would argue that the built environment has been the major factor that has highlighted and exposed some of the gaps in our society. And I think it has largely been issues of the built environment that determines, for example, how safe one is able to be during a pandemic. So access to sanitation, uncrowded living arrangements, safe transport to get to work are the major factors that ensure one's ability to guard against the dangers of the virus. And many people, often privileged people, have suggested that this time has been a leveler, and that's often the word that is used to indicate that in the face of this pandemic, we're somehow all equal, that in lockdown, we're all facing the same challenges together. But I would really disagree with this and actually argue the opposite, that the pandemic has shone a blinding light on the stark inequalities that we deal with, and specifically those in the built environment. And like any disaster, the ability for people to mitigate against the risks is dependent on so many different factors. And I think specifically in this pandemic, it has come down to the very basics in service delivery. So for example, access to running water and dignified housing. And I think what many people have been arguing is that we have been in crisis since long before the pandemic. And how is it that there are still settlements without sanitation? That should have been treated as a crisis long before 2020. But it has somehow only taken the pandemic to shake people into action. And we saw the very rapid delivery of sanitation infrastructure in the early days of the pandemic, proving that it is possible. So I think there are so many things that we can learn during this time about the fact that the state is capable when it wants to be, but we cannot keep waiting for a crisis to respond to the very basic rights that people have.
As a response to the pandemic, government's been implementing programs for de-densification. What have been the implications of this on the spatial agenda of densification? Has this agenda been undermined because of the need for social distancing?
We need to be able to separate the idea of densification from overcrowding and understand that even before the pandemic, the overcrowded conditions of so many areas have posed ongoing health risks for communities. What the national government was responding to was overcrowding, but called it de-densification. Densification poses a dignified response to a lack of space in targeted areas of opportunity and is very different to overcrowding. And South Africa's current density patterns present what is called a spatial contradiction. And this is that areas of opportunity, like economic centers, are less dense, and as you get further away to the outskirts, you see sprawling, unsustainable levels of overcrowding. And this was the legacy that apartheid spatial planners left us with. This is where cities' spatial agendas come in. So TOD, transit-oriented development, an idea of development corridors is used to bridge together the apartheid city through compact and efficient development. and compact cities allow for efficient use of resources, creating sustainable and inclusive settlements. So it's really about reconfiguring the very essence of a city. And in general, we are still very far away from achieving this. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I do believe that the mechanisms and the instruments in terms of the policy and legislation is now there.
Is there a way to fast track the whole process of spatial transformation?
It is such a complex and challenging task, spatial transformation. Like I said, it's about reconfiguring the very essence of a city. That is a huge and almost impossible task to do. And it requires the job of every government department, every sphere in government working together, and indeed every sector in society. So it's not something that can be done overnight, absolutely not. But I do think the way we are currently working is not fast enough. And we need leadership that is very clear in prioritizing this as something that everybody needs to be working on.
What has the pandemic shown us about technology and innovation in the built environment sector?
So I do believe that technology alone isn't going to solve our problems, and that we do need to focus on the basics and get the basics right. For example, when we look at the virus, the best way to curb the spread requires clean water, a face mask, and soap. Sophisticated technology can't solve our problems, but people definitely can. And working together in innovative ways between communities and government and using simple technologies to do that is very exciting. And I think what we have seen are some very innovative methodologies rather than groundbreaking technologies being used. And I think there have been interesting ways that very basic tech has been used to communicate with government. So for example, GovChat is a platform that connects people and communities to government. There are other kind of social auditing initiatives that have taken off during the pandemic. And these are all very exciting and I think speak to a culture of using real-time, on-the-ground data to plan and manage our cities. And this must be encouraged. But I think when we talk about tech, we also really need to talk about bridging the digital divide and understanding that during the pandemic, access to Wi-Fi and affordable internet data is now required for participating at the most basic level in decision-making and in employment opportunities. And I think we've been heading this way for a long time, but the pandemic has certainly emphasized it. I mean, when you think about how much data a Zoom meeting uses, I think it's somewhere up to 2 gigs per hour for a group Zoom meeting. How are you meant to participate in anything if you don't have access to data or Wi-Fi? So this is something that cities are certainly aware of and are prioritizing it more and more.
How have different cities responded to the built environment crisis that the pandemic has highlighted?
I think the most interesting cases have been in the provision of homeless shelters and how different cities have responded to this need during the pandemic. And it's really showed the importance of an empathetic approach and of communication and partnering with the end users. So for example, in the city of Cape Town, there was a disastrous example of people being forced to move to an area that was unsafe and undesirable to them. But in other cities like Tshwane and eThekwini, there have been much more holistic approaches to housing the homeless that includes not only the provision of shelter, but also a response to substance abuse through drug withdrawal programs and offering social support, which is so necessary during this time. So seeing that solution in a much more integrated way, rather than a kind of knee-jerk crisis mode reaction. And then internationally, there have been really interesting cases of pedestrianization. So for example, in central Paris, the major boulevards are being rethought for the use of pedestrians rather than cars. And originally this change was going to be temporary, but then became permanent. But it shouldn't necessarily take a pandemic to make these changes. And I think we shouldn't need a reduction in traffic before we start to prioritize pedestrians. And as cities, we need to really be setting the terms. So if we value non-motorized transport and pedestrians' rights to streets and the city, we need to be making those decisions preemptively and not just kind of responding when the crisis happens. But that being said, I think it is fantastic that cities around the world are seeing the opportunities. And certainly at the global level, the critique of how car-centric our cities are becoming is getting much louder and is having more impact. And I know in certain South African cities, this is also the case.
What are the immediate market impacts and shifts experienced from 2020?
The answer to this question is constantly changing. In the beginning of the pandemic, in the early days, people were saying that cities would become obsolete in the future. And I think that's certainly not the case. We can see that now. And I think with all major changes in society, we move towards hybrid typologies. So it's not going to be one or the other. It's not going to be that everyone leaves the city and lives rural lives. Absolutely not. But there will be more opportunities for hybrid living. And certainly there will be an effect on inner cities. What we might see is inner city spaces becoming more dynamic and more vibrant with more mixed use typologies and accommodation taking place where largely offices existed. So I think there are many exciting shifts that we are going to see, and the implications for inner cities particularly will be felt the strongest. And then, of course, there will be many implications for transport as well. What we are certainly moving towards is a more polycentric city layout. And I think this has been the case for a long time. It's not new in the pandemic, but it is perhaps becoming faster. What we might still see the rise of is centers at the neighborhood scale. And a very popular concept is the 15-minute city. And I think the pandemic is making this kind of approach a lot closer and a lot more realistic, where we don't have to travel as much in a day. We don't have to spend as much on transport. Our needs can be met in a much smaller radius from our homes. Apart from inner cities, I think there's also many implications for intermediary cities, so smaller cities and towns. And I do hope that we kind of see the growth of these cities, which have largely been on a path of neglect in many cases across the country. But what we need to caution against and remember during this time is seeing the further injustices in the built environment. And we need to be much more wary than ever of market forces that result in unlawful behavior, such as evictions. So this needs to be a time of high vigilance and understanding the link between the built environment and the market.
How can trust in physical spaces be regained?
So I don't think we have lost our trust. And in many ways, I do think there is more trust in our urban spaces than before. And what we've seen is how people have connected to the outdoors and to open public urban space with a lot more excitement and enthusiasm than before. And also people have connected with nature in new ways, and not only seeing nature as something that exists outside of the city or in opposition to the city, but rather as seeing nature and the city as being integrated and the city as existing in nature. So I think we've seen much better use of parks and public space. We've seen kind of outdoor exercising at a large scale, running and walking. And these are all activities that are very healthy, not only for our bodies, but for the city, because it creates a sense of vibrancy and of activity. And it's a wonderful way of playful and healthy way to interact with the urban space around us. And there were really nice articles early on in the pandemic showing how Joburg's previously underused parks were becoming vibrant spaces again. And that's trust, that didn't exist before. So it's really exciting how people are claiming public space and taking ownership of it again.
What are the main lessons taken from 2020, and how can we address them to not only survive but to thrive in the future?
So simply what I have seen and what's been the most exciting from practitioners in the cities is that it is possible to change, that cities can respond. And despite cities being very complex and quite slow to react, spaces, that doesn't mean that they cannot respond. And it's really important to understand that there is so much capability, especially in the metros. But what I think is very important for us all to understand is that more than ever, we are operating in an extremely constrained financial context, and that governments cannot and will not do everything. So prioritization becomes extremely important. But what we have shown during the pandemic is that even in this very constrained financial situation, when we all rally behind something, we can achieve it. What it's also shown, though, is that government can't do it alone, and there needs to be an all of society approach. And for this to happen in a healthy and constructive and sustainable way, we need to shift from talking about participation with communities to understand what partnership means and talk about partnership, meaningful partnership for an all of society approach. And this requires things that government isn't always good at doing. So listening deeply is one, and another is sometimes engaging communities on their own terms. And if we are able to do that, we can support the innovation that is already taking place because there is innovation all around us. Government is typically not the most innovative sector. Often it's civil society and the private sector. So as the state and as local government, we need to be asking how best can we enable others. But to do that, we need to listen and we need to partner properly. We cannot keep inviting others into the space of government where we have set the terms. So ultimately, I think we need to be responding to the needs of people with a much more empathetic response and with care. I think that the pandemic has certainly shown that. But to do this, we also need to be able to just stop for a moment, to breathe, reflect, because we cannot only be responding with knee-jerk reactions in a constant mode of crisis.